philosophy, they were saying, look, we know how the mind works. You philosophers have missed it. And what I thought, it took a while.
First, what did they think? How did they think the mind worked?
They said the mind, we have symbolic representations in our mind, that is, descriptions of the world, and we have rules for how to deal with the things that we've got descriptions of, and we're able to detect the features of things which define what they are, so that we can, the world comes sort of with little atomic things like this is round and it's brown and it's hard, and you can get all that into the description of it, and then we can recognize those things, and we can make computers that recognize that it's round and brown and hard, and have in them descriptions of things, and have in them rules for acting, and then they'll be like HAL in 2001. They said, in their jargon, human beings and properly programmed computers are physical symbol systems, and there's no difference. And that's, they took it over from philosophy. I mean, but you don't want to hear the names of the philosophers.
Oh, no, yeah.
Okay, well, it's fascinating. They took over the concepts and actions are based on rules from Kant, who said that in the 1700s. They took over the fact that there are these isolated primitive properties of things, basic properties of things, from way back to the atomists, really, in Greece, but Hume, another philosopher around time of Kant, an Enlightenment philosopher, believed that. Descartes, we believed that the whole picture of symbolic representations, he started it in about 1650, but then Leibniz, another generation later, had the view that you could write a language in which you could describe everything in terms of certain of primitives, and then you could just use logic to decide what was the case and what to do. So they were rationalists, atomists, cognitivists, these are the names for them, all these views that came from philosophy, telling me and thinking, them and their graduate students, all that. They didn't know about the philosophy, but they had the same view. It came down to them without their realizing how Cartesian and Leibnizian and Kantian they were. But they were saying, you guys never figured it out. We've got it figured out. And this is how it works. And two things were happening at once. It was amazing. They were saying that the philosophers didn't understand it, but they were using the very concepts that philosophers used to understand it, which failed to understand it. And they were wrong in two senses. One, they were philosophers, and two, they weren't understanding it. And only people like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, the anti-philosophers, saw this whole amazing kind of joke that they had taken over. They had philosophy had for 2,000 years finally discovered that this rationalist, atomistic, rule-following understanding of how the mind works is wrong. And in the meantime, it reappeared at the very moment that it was discovered to be wrong in the AI labs, where it turned out to be wrong. So here, all I had to do, and it was easy, all I had to do was just, because I knew it wouldn't work, say, this research program is going to fail. I can't predict how soon it's going to fail. Otherwise I would sell my stock short in the companies they were starting to make for making robots, but I know it's going to fail. And I'm trying to think whether it's important or not that I went to the RAND Corporation in '65 and wrote a paper. Yeah, I guess the first paper I wrote on it, by another strange coincidence, my brother, who was at the RAND Corporation, Hubert Dreyfus, applied mathematician, said to the head of the AI people there, they were called cognitive simulation then, that his brother, namely me, said it wasn't going to work, and the head of the AI people there said, isn't that funny, my brother who's in Israel has written me a letter saying don't invest in this, Merleau-Ponty says it's not going to work. So Stuart said, well, why don't you hire my brother, he'll explain to you why. So the RAND Corporation hired me, and Newell and Simon were at the RAND Corporation. They were the ones who said we are physical symbol systems. So I got a chance to meet them and read their papers, and I wrote a paper showing how they were wrong, called Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence, claiming they were like alchemists, not chemists.
Can you, let's just, one more minute dwell on the fact that maybe, computers had just started appearing
That's right.
at that time, and they thought, well, the computer does this way, so the mind must be like a computer, therefore we must make a computer that could be like a mind, right?
That's the idea. That's the idea.
Did you say that?
That's the idea of the physical symbol system. The idea was computers use atomic facts, work according to rules, require representations, symbolic representations of the world, and deduce logically what to do on the basis of that. We know computers do that. We know how to make software that does that. So that must be how the brain does it. And we must be the software running on the brain, which is the hardware. Philosophers just loved that. That was called functionalism. I mean, not my philosophers, but the analytic philosophers were totally seduced by this.
So now you write this paper. What do you say in this paper?
Okay, I just say roughly what I've been saying. You guys have picked up this wrong view, and but here's how, and then I analyze their papers. You draw conclusions on the basis of a little bit of success in a very narrow area, so this is the same way we do it in a broader way, and you have no right to that conclusion, and the phenomena suggest that that's not how we do it, and then, so I had this paper which said, in effect, what you're doing is wrong. Since it's wrong, we'd expect you to have failures, not successes. Your papers, which you present as successes, really are special cases and generalize illegitimately from these special cases. The papers are failures, and then for, I don't know, 20 years, I guess maybe, I sort of followed them step by step, showing each time when they made these new predictions and new software, predicting how it was going to fail. And it always failed just that way.
Can we give do you remember any of the practical examples of some of the basic manifestations of intelligence that they were trying to exhibit in a computer that you knew they weren't going to be able to do?
Yeah, the main one is the one that Minsky talked about and that I just mentioned a moment ago, namely the common sense knowledge problem. So there I was at MIT in 1970. Oh, by the way, the RAND paper, Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence, the RAND company wouldn't distribute it. RAND papers were supposed to be sort of available to anybody who wrote for them. They wouldn't call my results at RAND a RAND paper because they didn't want to put their name on it, but it was a RAND memo. They couldn't, my brother insisted that they couldn't, having paid me as a consultant, and this is what I wrote, they couldn't not have it as a RAND memo, but then they wouldn't distribute it. And finally it became a very successful RAND memo, and it's now a kind of classic in museums and so forth. But there was this huge effort to suppress this criticism, mainly because there were millions of dollars at stake, because the DARPA, the defense, what is DARPA? Department of what? I don't know either. But anyway, DARPA gave the money for the research, defense research, and they were afraid that if DARPA read my RAND paper, then they would stop giving the money. And then when I was at MIT, they were even more afraid because the AI lab got about $1 million a year from DARPA for AI research. And they were afraid that if they ever read my paper, they would take away their money. And in the end, that's sort of what happened. So I have to jump ahead there. At that point, I was just fantasizing getting an actor dressed up as somebody in the military and having lunch with them in the faculty club and scaring these people in the AI lab out of their wits, but I never did it. So anyway, here you asked me, what's a problem? In 1970 was the main problem. Okay, and it was the common sense knowledge problem. They discovered that, well, they wanted the computer to be intelligent, therefore they wanted it to be able to answer questions the way, and they decided if it was as smart as, say, I forget exactly the age, let's say a 4-year-old, that would be a good step in the right direction. So they started to try to program something that Minsky, the head of the AI lab, called a script. A script, this was going to be the birthday party script, and it was going to tell the computer what a birthday party was and what people did at a birthday party, and then it could answer questions about the birthday party. So, for instance, it would say, why did all these people go to Joe's house and bring him presents? And it would say it must have been a birthday party, and then it can say what did they have to eat, and it could look up its thing that Minsky had given it, its frame, and it would say ice cream and cake and so forth. But then they went further. They said, the test was, they said to the program, one of the characters says, why don't you buy him a kite? And another one says, he's already got a kite, he'll make you take it back. And they were going to show, the intelligence was going to be, that it would recognize, the computer, which you were taking back. Whether you were taking back, he already has a kite, he'll make you take it back. Does that mean the one that they just brought? Or does that mean the one that he already has? And they were smart enough to be right to worry about that, but they didn't see that a whole huge amount of background knowledge, common sense knowledge, is already in there. That when you buy something, you can't take back the used one, you've got to take back the new one, even if you wanted to take back the old one. And this is now where I wrote my paper. And they said, the principle is anyway, if you've already got one, you don't want another one just like it. And I wrote, and does this apply to cookies? Or does it apply only to very big cookies like this? Or wouldn't, even if you were a cookie monster, wouldn't you even want a big cookie? And so forth. I mean, that there was just endless questions you could ask a 4-year-old that they could answer, that this computer wouldn't even know what to begin to answer. And they thought it was just a little problem, that they would fix it, that they would deal with what they called in micro worlds, where all the relevant knowledge was in there somehow. And the birthday party, what's it called, frame, was supposed to be an example of that. No, never mind, about something else. Well, parenthetically, you could leave it out. I think they got this idea of frames from Husserl, because there was a student who had
frames, yeah. What do you mean?
Well, frames are, the birthday party frame says birthday parties are something that kids have once a year, and people bring presents, and they eat ice cream and cake, and the parents, so forth. Whatever, it was supposed to give the computer knowledge about birthday parties was to give it a birthday party frame. And common sense knowledge, Minsky said, was made out of several million frames. And so the funny thing was that there was a student, I still can remember his name, Jim Geyser, who had my Husserl course. And Husserl had an idea of frames, and he called them frames. And he said, in the frames, part of what is a necessary feature is, and then there are default features. So it probably is like this. So it's necessary for a birthday party that Minsky, and Husserl stopped there. But Minsky says, well, it's necessary for a birthday party that there be a kid and that he be born and he have a birthday. And it's optional. That is, default assignment is, the assumption is that anybody who comes to the party will bring a present. That's not quite right, because the parents aren't bringing each one a present and so forth. But all of that, sort of, oddly enough, they got that loser view from philosophy too, also. Every loser view that they had, they unknowingly got it from philosophy, and it didn't work in Husserl, and it didn't work for them. And now Minsky is saying, I repeat it, AI has been brain dead since the early 70s, which is when I wrote my paper, wrote my book. The common sense knowledge thing is after the Rand paper. Another series of weird events happened.
So how do we, so what's going on with us that we, a 4-year-old, find it so easy to understand all these common sense questions? And what was your critique, and then what was their reaction to that critique?
Okay, my critique was just to show that common sense knowledge is a huge something or other, and it's not, and it could be a huge bunch of facts, but it isn't even a huge bunch of facts, because what counts as a fact depends on the situation, and then how you, and whether you if you recognize this as, say, Christmas present giving situation, then the fact is these are going to be counted as Christmas presents, and you won't be able to open them right away. I'm just making this up, but I just said, look, there's all these facts. millions of facts, millions of frames. That's already too hard for you. But moreover, there's not just a fixed number of facts and frames, but it depends on the background customs that you don't even know you got, that you took over by imitation when you were a child, and it depends on your own interests, what's going to count as the facts. And I had a whole list of reasons why that, and it's got to do a lot with understanding what's relevant, because you just can't take account of all the facts in this room. There's an infinite number of facts about this room, but what's relevant right now is that I'm sitting here talking to you, and the lights are relevant, cameras are relevant. If there's any dust on the floor under this chair, it's not. I mean, that we have this whole thing, and they don't know how to do the difference between relevance and accidents at all, I said. Now, the next thing you say is very interesting. Well, it would have been marvelous if I could have said, this is how you're trying to do it, and it won't work, but here's how the brain really does it, and how it works. But I couldn't, and nobody's got a clue yet. I mean, they've been brain dead, and so has cognitive science been brain dead since the early 70s. The latest version is, I say in my book that this relevance thing is very important, that we can recognize relevance even though we've never seen it before. And I give the example, if you're a horse bettor and you know that the jockey has hay fever, and you see that the horse track is surrounded by goldenrod, you don't bet on that horse to win, even though it's the best horse with the best jockey. You see the relevance of the goldenrod. We're able to see relevance of things that we've never been specifically told are relevant. And
they thought that if you just had a computer powerful enough and you had someone programming enough information in there, then that's why they didn't have artificial intelligence yet, but they just needed a processor and a computer that's fast enough and full of enough facts.
That's right. That's where Minsky was stupid and now retroactively admits I was bright, in the sense that they went on and on. In the 70s, instead of trying to program all that information, the usual reaction was, let's start with some simple world in which we list all the relevant facts and leave out all the irrelevant facts and get the computer to answer questions about that world. And they could do that. And then every PhD thesis I noticed one day at MIT always promises that they will make the micro world, as it was called, more and more realistic, and then they'll have common sense knowledge. And there was never any follow-up to any of these PhD theses, because it didn't get them anywhere to make it more and more realistic. It was still sort of infinitely, really, or something hopelessly wrong-headed, because it wasn't a question of just putting in the facts, but this issue of relevance was absolutely central, and they couldn't cope with it.
So you wrote a book then. Well, tell me about the book you wrote that was
okay. I wrote in '72 What Computers Can't Do, based on the Rand paper. It's so, everything that happens is so weird. I mean, I didn't want to think of writing a book, and Harper and Row came to me and asked me to write a book. But that happened because, in some amazing way, the Rand paper got picked up by the New Yorker and was the first item of the talk of the town in '65 or something like that. And then a guy named Peter Drucker, who's a famous management consultant, told Harper and Row they had to have a book, and they told me to write a book. Most people, submit a proposal to a publisher. So I said, okay, I'll write a book. And so I turned the Rand paper into this book, What Computers Can't Do.
And can you talk specifically about how you took Heidegger's ideas and
I quoted Heidegger. There's no answer to the question how we do this common sense knowledge thing of seeing what's relevant and so forth, but at least Heidegger has a name for it, and it's familiarity, and we just have familiarity with the world. Unfortunately for everybody, nobody has a clue how we have it. Doesn't bother Heidegger, that's not his job, but it's the job of cognitive science. Let me say a word about that. One of the best cognitive science people is Jerry Fodor, who's in philosophy and psychology, who's written a book lately, they haven't got any conclusion for the common sense knowledge problem, but they're going on making micro worlds or doing whatever they're doing. And in his book called The Mind Doesn't Work Like That, the last paragraph says something like, and should a Dreyfus ask us how we can tell what's relevant to anything else, our response would be total silence. I mean, in other words, a very good philosopher, psychology person recognizes that they haven't a clue how to deal with relevance and familiarity. And the moral is, I think they should keep trying, but Heidegger's going to describe familiarity. He's going to describe the way doors call us to go in and out, and tables call us to put things on and so forth, and how and we respond to the relevance of things, and that's the best we can do.
Can you talk about the difference between the way a human drives a car or plays chess, and the way, recently there was a competition to see.
Wait, I forgot a whole other thing I have to put in.
Go ahead.
There's so much you have to put in. You can leave out some of it. We can't get to that yet. One is, now everybody's given up on the common sense knowledge problem, except one person named Doug Lennat. Doug Lennat has now been promised something like 30 years ago that in 10 years he, just by putting in more and more facts and more frames, would solve the common sense knowledge problem. It's now 30 years later. He's still trying. He's, according to his assistant named Gua, who has quit and whom I had lunch with, he says Doug has lost touch with reality. I mean, I don't have any firsthand information. I've often offered to be on panels with him and so forth, but he has never faced up to the fact that I would try to point out that he's getting nowhere, because the relevance problem is all over the place. But
he's just listing millions and millions of facts into a computer.
Yep, and frames, in frames, not just at random, but birthday party frames and war frames and driving frames, to go back to that again. All that we know about all of these things, he's putting into the computer, millions of them, just as Minsky said you had to do, and it's not working, just as I said, of course it wouldn't, but he goes on. And oddly enough, he gets a little money. I don't know how much from the Air Force or from DARPA or something, that still has the hope somehow that they will get an intelligent computer thanks to Lennat, but they won't. So now we have to go. There's 2 or 3 things I have to talk to you about. The next thing is, at a certain point, I think it must be around in the 80s somewhere. Yeah, in the 80s, definitely, early 80s. The AI people began to realize that they can't solve the common sense knowledge problem, that they are never able to make their micro worlds more and more realistic, and so forth. So they tried a whole new thing. They thought, well, where do we have intelligence with no context, and where you don't need any common sense knowledge? And that is in many domains. Experts don't need to have any common sense knowledge. If you're an expert in diagnosing blood diseases on the basis of blood tests, you don't need to know what a germ is or what a person is or what blood is. You just need to have the skill of that you can find. And what is the skill? Well, it's a bunch of rules for taking the results of the blood test and finding, and in this case it's meningitis, and in this case it's laryngitis, and so forth. And they get all excited about expert systems as the way you should go. And then the power passed from MIT and Minsky to Feigenbaum at Stanford, who was the guy doing expert systems, and they starting companies to make expert systems, but they didn't really have any expert systems that did anything near what experts did. They always were just competent. They had a blood disease system, and it could do well enough to even be useful as a first screening, or when you didn't have any experts around. But it never was as good as the experts. And that was true of, it seems, of all the expert systems where there is intuitive expertise. There are some things that are so complicated that people don't have intuitive expertise, and then the expert systems can do better than the people. But in most areas, when you've had enough experience, people have had enough experience, they have skills which don't seem to be rules, and can't be captured in rules, or at least haven't been able to be captured in rules. And so my brother and I predicted failure for the expert systems business, and I again tried to see if I could buy stock in these expert systems companies that people were starting, and again discovered that unless I could predict when they would fail, I couldn't sell my stock short like I wanted to do, which is too bad because they all failed. And in the meantime, my brother and I wrote a book called Mind Over Machine, which was about expert systems and why they would fail. They don't fail because of the common sense knowledge problem. They fail because we're back to the story about bicycles and shoelaces and stuff, that people don't have rules. They start with rules as beginners. They get more sophisticated when they add to the rules the hearing the background sounds like in driving a car, knowing when the motor's racing and so forth. They get even better when they understand that they have to know what's relevant, and if you're going up a hill, you better pay attention to the sound of the motor, but if you're going down a freeway, you better pay attention to the speed limit and so forth. They know the people. So if you're a beginner, you follow rules. If you're an advanced beginner, you follow rules and you recognize aspects, I call it, things about the situation that are relevant. If you're proficient, you also discover you have to have a goal and pay attention only to what's relevant to that goal. And computers can get that far. Well, competent they can get, which is having a goal and paying attention to it. The next stage beyond that is, well, let's talk about driving again. So you start with the rules. We talked about the clutch and the brake and the gear shift. You go to this next stage of advanced beginner, listening for the aspects of the motor racing and so forth. You go to the next stage in which you have a plan, as you understand what's relevant and you pay attention to that. So going on an off-ramp, you pay attention to getting the right speed so that you don't get honked at for going too slow, or go into a skid for going too fast. And you learn the hard way. You learn by getting honked at and going into skids, but after a while, you stop doing that. You finally become an expert driver. What's an expert driver do? He goes on an off-ramp without the slightest idea what the right speed is and so forth. He can be caught thinking about something else, or talking, or listening to music. His foot is doing what needs to be done, and his car is doing what needs to be done. And now back to the expert story. We now know something about how the brain does that. The way it sets up what's called the neural networks, and maybe they form attractors, and they've discovered the part of the brain that keeps track of whether things are going well, or signals that you have to start paying attention because things are going wrong. And all of that knowledge about skills explains what we really do and how it isn't like expert systems, because it isn't as if we still do what beginners do, namely follow rules only unconsciously. We do something entirely different. We respond to whole situations, and we respond only to what's relevant in whole situations. You look like you want to say something.
No, I wanted to talk about the difference between, like, at the time, did you think that they would come up with a computer that could play chess as well as a human? And if not, why not? And now when that did happen, what is the difference between the way the computer's playing chess just as well as a human?
Right.
It looks
Better.
like it's exhibiting intelligent behavior, but why is why did that not count? And what makes the way humans do it
that's
special?
important.
That's a good example.
When Deep Blue finally beat Kasparov,
Hang on, one second.
I debated a philosopher named Dan Dennett on the.
Wait, say that again, 'cause I was talking over you.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
That's an important question,
It is
and
very
people
important.
worried about that. And when Deep Blue, or I guess it was, I'm not sure which one it was, the beat
Okay, one more time. Go ahead.
Okay, that's a good question. And when whatever program it was, I think it wasn't Deep Blue anymore, it was some further advanced computer program, beat Kasparov, who was the world champion, there was a lot of interest in the question, well, now haven't we made an expert system that's better than the experts? And I was on, what was it? Dan Rather program of some sort or other, debating with Dan Dennett, who's a philosopher who believes in AI, about this and so forth. Well, the answer seems to me to be that, and it's surely right, it doesn't just seem to me, the answer is it's not an expert system, because expert systems try to get the rules from the experts and use the rules in the computer to generate expertise. But what happens in a game like chess, where there's a finite number of rules and a finite number of places pieces can move, and what's relevant and irrelevant is totally settled. I mean, it's irrelevant if you're in the middle or off to the side of a square. It's irrelevant whether the board is dusty or clean. It's relevant but it's relevant whether the piece is white or black. I mean, that's all fixed. So when it's fixed, you can calculate way ahead. So they now look at something like 1 billion moves before the computer does, before it makes a move. I think it's around 1 billion now, I'm not sure exactly. And that means it can look, I don't know again the details, probably 10 moves ahead when it makes a move. Now, a grandmaster can only look at 200 or 300 moves, and normally doesn't need to look ahead at all. There's this famous remark by Capablanca, who's perhaps the greatest grandmaster ever, who says, they ask me how many moves I look ahead. I only look one move ahead, but it's always the right one. And that's how it is with masters. They don't calculate. Something else happens in their brain, neural nets again of some sort. But so the fact that a computer beat the world champion at chess shows that if you can use brute force and look at millions of moves in a closed world, which has to be like a game, so that you can look at everything relevant, and then you can beat human beings who are good at, who are so amazing that they can almost hold out against a computer looking at millions of moves each second. But in the end, if you look at enough millions of moves each second, you will finally be able to beat all human beings. My brother and I knew that. When we wrote our book, Mind Over Machine, we said that, I said it, I guess maybe in my What Computers Can't Do. Anyway, we said that one thing is computers can only, when we said this way back in the 60s, computers can only play beginner chess. We also said, or at least we thought, I don't remember as far back, that we knew anyway, that of course if you get fast enough, you'll eventually win. We did think it would take longer to get that fast, and maybe more speed to win, but it turned out to be sooner and better than we would have guessed. But the AI people are so desperate. I'm just putting a plug in for something I care about. They quote, it's in the RAND paper. I say computers can at best play the chess of a child. And in the context, it's clear that I'm reporting on what is the state of the computer world at that point. But they take it out of context, and they say Dreyfus said that computers could only play as well as a 10-year-old, I think it was, and look what happened. One, a computer beat Dreyfus. I'm not a very good chess player, and I took on it, but they asked me to play against a chess program at MIT, and I did, and I lost. And Stuart came back and beat it. Stuart's a good chess player. He was captain of the Harvard team, but I'm not a good chess player. But that's all irrelevant. I mean, the idea that they're so desperate, that it's still appearing in books. Dreyfus said that the computer could only play as well as a 10-year-old, and it beat Dreyfus, so there. And pathetic. But it's not important. It's interesting, but it's not important. Because
didn't you do a test with your brother with a master chess player wearing headphones and having to count beeps? And
we that's right. We did experiments when we were doing the skills story, the 5 stages that I just talked about, where we got up to experts, where experts, according to us, this is really Stuart's story, but I'll call it us. We signed the book together. it's wonderful that he, as an applied mathematician, could see these things that philosophers after 2,000 years had been so busy looking for the rules that they couldn't see it. They weren't good phenomenologists, but he just started thinking about how you drive and how you play chess and how you learn to go from beginner to expert. And he said that it looks like experts don't use the calculating part of their brain at all. Now this come experiment. And how would you test that? Well, we sort of tried to test it. He did. We got a chess world champion. He was world junior champion. And he was a graduate student in my brother's department. And we got him to play with a chess master, but we required him to count by threes. In something I read, it says backwards by threes. I thought it was just forward by threes, but never mind. To do some kind of calculation and to keep doing it without making mistakes and without slowing down while playing chess with this chess master. And he could do it. That is, he didn't have to do any analysis. He didn't have to follow any rules or look at anything. He could just make the appropriate move. Now I know things that I didn't know then, that there's something called blitz chess, in which they play at a second a move. They play as fast as they can move their arms, these grandmasters, and they still play master level chess. It's just something goes into the neural net that's been trained enough, and a move comes out.
Without talking about the neural nets, what is it that's so amazing about what humans are doing in these situations that's not calculating? Can you talk about the fact that they're able to respond to the situation as a whole instead of like making up of its atomic parts?
That's right. They respond to the whole situation. Moreover, they respond to what's relevant in the whole situation and not just all of it equally. They respond almost instantly with an appropriate response if they're masters in any domain. Chess is interesting because you can find out who the grandmasters are, and because people think it requires some kind of analysis. And they have to do analysis, even the grandmasters, if they find themselves in a position that's unfamiliar, like a chess problem. But normally, they just do what works right away. And this is also why chess it's all clearest with them. If they're grandmasters, they can play an indefinitely large number of games, just going from board to board, as they do in demos, and they don't have to, when they see each board, figure out what they did last and what the position is and what the other guy did last. They just make a move, then they look at the next pattern and they can make a move. And now I've just discovered something even more amazing, that at least they have it on the board in front of them where things have gotten to at a certain pattern, and they make a move. They can do it blindfolded. I think the record is 40 games that somebody can keep in their mind, 40 different chess games, and update them.
Doesn't that go against your whole theory in a way, because they're not responding to an outer chess situation, but they're just like have the representation of the chess set in their mind?
That's fascinating response. No, yes and no. I mean, but the representation isn't playing an essential role in it. I mean, it's like they can have a copy in their mind, and still play this high-level chess. But the important thing is they can play this high-level chess, presumably without a copy in their mind. Now, how do we know that? Let me think.
That's been bothering me about just thinking about the movie, about using blindfolded chess, but it seems to...
you've been thinking about that. Very good. I don't think it's a real problem, but it may be a real problem for the movie, because it looks like it's all going on in their mind. And it is all going on in their mind, in the sense that they have to, in some way, remember all these patterns. I doubt if they can consciously remember all these patterns. It would be fun to interview them and ask them, but their brain somehow has recorded all the patterns because they're blindfolded. What you'd have to do is try to figure out, at some point it looks to me like they couldn't do it anymore, that their memory would be overloaded, whereas, say, maybe at 100 games, they couldn't do it. Whereas, of course, if the grandmaster had 100 boards laid out, he could just go from board to board.
He could have 10,000. He could just keep playing.
Right, and that's because representing it in their mind is not an essential feature of it. I mean, you could just as long as it's there on the board in the real world. But it is interesting. People do have minds, and they do have, some people, iconic memories where they can actually have pictures in their mind. And maybe these people have amazing, iconic memories. It's amazing that people have that kind of memory.
Okay, let's move forward. Hold on, I'm going to swap batteries out.
And I'll go to the men's room.
Go ahead.